Okay, we're back with Pete by Roland Smith, chapter 19, called Bear and Bull. Bear and Bull. All right. 3 teams, A, B, and C. We were the C team. Sunjo, me, the film crew, and Holly, led by Zopa, Yogi, and Yash. I guess the brothers had not hitched a ride to find a job on the mountain. They already had a job. Zopa had hired them to help him get Sunjo to the summit. And I think the C stood for covert, not third, because we were getting the first summit shot, not the last. And somehow we were supposed to keep all of this quiet. The night before, Josh and Thaddeus hadn't told us the outright lie to the other climbers, but they came pretty close to it. We'll have to keep this to ourselves, Thaddeus had said, lowering his voice despite the fact that it was 10 degrees below zero outside and the wind was howling down the mountain at about 25 miles an hour. It wasn't likely someone was standing outside the flap eavesdropping. Thaddeus is right, Josh agreed. Some of the other climbers are real head cases. There'll be a fight over who goes first. It's ridiculous. But it's the same every year. They can't get into their oxygen-starved brains that reaching the summit has nothing to do with the order you climb. It depends on the weather. Josh was fudging this a little. Sitting at base camp or up at ABC waiting your turn increases your chances of catching a virus or twisting an ankle, to say nothing of the sheer boredom and psychological damage of lying in your cramped tent day after day wondering if you're going to make it to the top. We were getting the first shot because of my birthday, period. It could take every one of those 30 plus days to get me to the top before I turned 15. In case anyone asks, Thaddeus said, "This is what we're doing." He looked at the film crew. "You're making a documentary about Sherpas." He looked at Holly. "You're writing the story about Sherpas." He looked at me. "You're just tagging along to help with the filming." As far as anyone knows, a summit attempt is not even part of the documentary. "Sunjo's going to have to move to the Porter camp tonight," Josh said. "It's the only way we can keep him under wraps. Can you arrange that, Zopa?" Zopa nodded. Josh looked at Sunjo. "Captain Sheck and the soldiers rarely go to the Porter camp, but just to be safe, you need to dress and act like a porter. No fancy Western climbing clothes. The porters are hauling supplies up the mountain the day after tomorrow. You'll all go with them. When you get to intermediate camp, out of sight of the Chinese, you can change into your climbing gear. When you come back down, you'll need to change your clothes and stick with the porters. If Shek catches you, you're toast." "Toast?" Sunjo asked. "You'll be chipping boulders into gravel," I explained. "Oh." A look of dread crossed Sunjo's usually calm and cheerful face. So Josh continued. "Zopa will lead the C team. I'll lead the A team, and Pa Sang will lead the B team." I was disappointed that I wouldn't be trying for the summit with my father, but I wasn't surprised. Change of plans had been the theme of our relationship my whole life. I was also worried about Zopa and Sunjo. "Paranoia feeds on thin air." That's a direct quote from one of Josh's climbing books, and the feeling was beginning to gnaw at my guts. With Sunjo in the mix, it seemed to me that he and Zopa had everything to gain if I didn't make it to the summit. I'm not saying that they would try to stop me, but even the slightest mistake, accidental or intentional, could end my climb. And no one would be the wiser. Bad things happen on mountains. It's part of every climb. And when something goes wrong, it's usually blamed on bad equipment, bad weather, bad luck, rarely on the climbers themselves. "Any questions?" Josh asked. Well, I had a couple dozen questions like, if Zopa could get forged papers good enough to get Sunjo over the Friendship Bridge, why should we trust his tattered birth certificate? He could be 6 months younger than me for all we know. Zopa knew exactly when my birthday was. He was there when Mom radioed Josh on Annapurna. Was Josh hedging his bets by sending Sunjo up with me? If I didn't make it, Josh's company would still receive the credit for getting the youngest climber to the top of the Mount Everest. Sunjo was on his climbing permit as well. Didn't really matter to Josh which of us made it to the top. But I didn't ask questions or even make a comment. I was so confused and mad that I didn't trust myself to even open my mouth. "There's no way we'll be able to keep this a secret from the other climbers," JR said. "There's only one final approach to the summit, and we'll all be taking it, single file like ants." Josh gave him the grin. "No worries. Once the A and B teams get to Camp 4, the only thing they'll be thinking about is where their next breath is coming from." "What about when they get back to base camp?" JR asked. "If they get to the summit, they won't care who made it to the top and who didn't," Josh answered. "The important thing is to give them a good chance. Your team will be 4 or 5 days ahead of A and B. When you get above Camp 4, be careful what you say on the radio. One slip of the tongue and everyone on this side of the mountain will know what we're up to. When you pass us on your way down, don't say anything about the summit. We'll sort it out later. The other climbers are done with their second trip to ABC, JR persisted. They're at least a week ahead of us in terms of acclimatization. He was right. The third trip to ABC was when you usually tried for the summit. We were a trip behind Josh's other climbers. If the weather breaks our way, we'll try to get them to the top sooner, Josh said. If not, they'll have to wait it out at base camp along with everyone else. We can't all head up to the top at the same time. There isn't enough room. Which meant the other climbers could be sitting at base camp for another 6 weeks before getting their shot at the summit, and I knew that would not sit well with them. I had a lousy night, lying in my sleeping bag, thinking of all the ways Zopa and Sunjo could sabotage my summit trying if they wanted to. It was a depressingly long list. Late the next morning, when I finally poked my head out of my tent, a light snow was falling. I got dressed, went over to the mess tent, where I found Zopa and the film crew talking quietly about the shift in the documentary. Or were they talking about me until they saw me walk up? Josh was sure right about the thin air paranoia thing. Are you sick again? Zopa asked. Don't you wish, I thought, but I told him that I'd never felt better in my life. He didn't look like he believed me. I dished up a bowl of oatmeal, then took a seat at the table next to them. We had the tent to ourselves, except for the cook cleaning up after breakfast rush. As soon as you finish eating, JR said, I'll show you how to use this camera. Why? Because there's a decent chance that Jack, Will, and I won't make it to the summit. Someone has to get it on film. They were all strong climbers. It hadn't occurred to me that they might not make it to the top. We'll try, Jack said, but you never know. This is my third trip to Everest, JR said. The closest I've gotten was just above Camp 6. The weather turned us back, and that was it. I'll give you one of our mini cameras. He looked at his watch. We'll meet you and Zopa outside HQ in 15 minutes and head over to the Porter camp to shoot some footage. They got up and left the tent. I looked at Zopa. Have you seen Josh? He took some of his team up the mountain to practice climbing techniques. I must have looked a little annoyed because Zopa studied me for a moment, then he said, How do you feel about your father now that you have spent some time with him? Well, I haven't really spent much time with him, I answered, dodging the question. Zopa sipped his tea, then said, He can't help himself, you know. What do you mean? In climbing, he has found something he is very good at, something he has a passion for. Not many men find that. But what do you do when you get too old to climb mountains? Zopa laughed. Most climbers do not get old. You did. I stopped climbing. Why? My children were grown. I no longer needed the money. You must have climbed for more than money. Of course, but if I wasn't paid, I would have never climbed at all. You climb for sport. Sherpas climb to support their families. So you're here to help Sunjo become a Sherpa, I said? No. I'm here so Sunjo does not have to become a Sherpa. What do you mean? I know you're angry at me for not telling you about my plan for Sunjo, and you're upset with Sunjo for not telling you I am his grandfather. What does that have to do with your not wanting Sunjo to become a Sherpa? To get him this far, there were things I had to keep to myself, things I asked Sunjo to keep to himself. He really didn't know what I had in mind until I told him at ABC. I could not tell him until I saw how he did on the mountain. If he makes it to the summit, the notoriety it brings him will allow him to go back to school. I'm hoping he never has to climb again. Is that birth certificate real? Yes. Sunjo is a week older than you. What if I make it to the summit too? Zopa shrugged. This was not the answer I was hoping for. I know what you're thinking, I said. You can never tell who the mountain will allow or who it will not. Zopa smiled, and he got up from the table. I'll see you over at HQ. I'm going to make it to the summit, I told him as he walked out of the mess tent. In a strange way, the conversation helped to center me. It reminded me that climbing, even though there might be other people in your party, is a solo sport. Your legs, your arms, your muscles, your endurance, your will, and yours alone. A partner can encourage you, maybe even stop you from falling, but they can't get you to the top. That's entirely up to you. I finished my breakfast feeling a little better, and I walked over to HQ to meet the film crew. Zopa was there, but Holly wasn't. She's already over at the Porter camp, JR explained. Dr. Krieger had some meds for Sunjo, but didn't want to take them to the camp herself. Captain Sheck would find that suspicious. Doctors do not treat porters. Holly took them over for her. I guess I wasn't the only one being transformed by the mountain. Holly had undergone a remarkable change since we got up to ABC, and it was clear by JR's attitude that I wasn't the only one to notice. Her voice was still a little shrill, and she still wore her garish clothes, but she had taken care of me at ABC, and now she was looking after Sunjo. I don't think she would have done that the first day she got to base camp. JR handed me a small camera about the size of a sandwich. I know it doesn't look like much, he explained, but it's reliable at high altitudes and it takes pretty good video. Not as good as the one we've been using, but hauling the big one to the summit is a pain in the rear. He showed me how to zoom in and out, how to frame a shot, how to use the built-in microphone, and how to change the memory card, which held about an hour of video. You have to be pretty close to pick up a voice, Jack explained, especially if the wind's blowing. Whoever's talking will probably have to shout. Consider the camera yours until the climb is over, JR said. We have another one we'll take up to the top if we make it that far. You need to practice with it. The hardest part is hitting the little buttons with gloves on. So practice with gloves. If you take off your gloves, above Camp 5, your fingers will fall off, and you'll be pushing buttons with your nose for the rest of your life. Yeah, pleasant thought. What am I supposed to be filming, I asked. The story, Will said. What story? That's the big question, JR answered, and part of the fun. And the mystery, Jack added. Josh hired us to film you, JR continued. Now Sunjo's been added to the mix, which changes the story. If you and Sunjo don't make it to the summit, the story will shift again. It might be about how you didn't make it, what stopped you. It might be about the friendship between you two, which is pretty shaky at the moment, but I didn't tell them that. Or Sunjo and Zopa, or you and your father. The point is that we won't know what the story is about until we know how the story ends. All we can do now is film the details. When we get done, we'll piece the documentary together like a jigsaw puzzle, which is exactly how Vincent at GSS taught me to put together a story. He wouldn't let me write a word until I'd finished my research. Hold the story inside until you are ready to burst. He made me write my research notes on 3x5 cards. One card, on each card was a sentence, a scene, a character note, or a detail from my research. When you do your research, write down whatever interests you, whatever stimulates your imagination, whatever seems important. A story is built like a stone wall. Not all the stones will fit, some will have to be discarded, some broken and reshaped. When you finish the wall, it may not look exactly like the wall you envisioned, but it will keep the livestock in and the predators out. I wonder if Vincent would accept a documentary in place of a moleskin, but I doubted it. It would be great, JR continued, if you could write down your shots. It's not easy to do, especially at high altitudes, but it would help us when we edit. If you can't write them down, Jack suggested, you can record what you're doing on the microphone. From a distance, the Porter camp looked neat and prosperous, but as we got closer, it became clear that it was neither. It seemed that everything in it was made out of cast-offs, as if the Porters hung around after the climbing season and collected the leftovers from our camp and put it in theirs. There were a couple of shacks that had been flattened tin cans nailed to them to the wood. The tents were sewn together from bits and pieces of other tents. The yak halters were made from frayed climbing ropes. The camp had a different smell to it as well. Dung, wood, smoke, and the old palm oil that the Porters cooked their food in. But the smell and disarray were soon forgotten in the minor stampede of men that came running when they saw Zopa. Sunjo and Holly came out of a battered tent and joined us. Sunjo still looked pretty weak, which I wasn't unhappy to see. I wondered how he was going to do tomorrow when we headed back to ABC. He pulled me to the side. I appreciate your standing up for me last night, he said. I am sorry I didn't tell you about Zopa. Forget it, I said, although I hadn't come close to forgetting it myself. How was it staying here last night? It's not as comfortable as the climbing camp, but the Porters have been very kind. The Porters had lined up in a long row, and Zopa was walking down the line greeting each in turn and giving blessings. When he finished, we sat down in a large circle on the blankets and a sleeping bag, and we talked, with Zopa translating. A good way to understand what the Porters do for a living is to think of them as Himalayan truckers. The only difference is that their trucks have legs instead of wheels and are fueled by grass instead of diesel. The nearest restaurant to our cabin in Wyoming was a truck stop. Mom and I used to go there all the time, and we loved it. The truckers were friendly, funny, and full of stories. It was no different with the Porters. I got so involved in their stories, I completely forgot about using my camera. The Porters were from all over Tibet and Nepal and spent 9 months out of the year away from home. When they were hauling gear up Everest and other mountains, they were guiding trekkers or moving supplies at lower altitudes. Most of the younger Porters wanted to become climbing Sherpas because the money was better. The older porters seemed satisfied driving their yaks in spite of their hardships. They told us stories about falls and getting lost, but the most grim story was related at the end of the day by an old porter named Gulu, who was from the same village where Sunjo was born. Gulu knew Sunjo's mother well and claimed to have taken Sunjo on his first yak ride when he was a baby. The porters and Sherpas were spread out over thousands of barren miles, but there were always seemed to be connections like this between them. On the way back to camp, JR said that Gulu's story was compelling, but he couldn't use it in the final documentary. There was no room, which is why I included here. Vincent taught me that what makes a story unique is not necessarily the information in the story, but what the writer chooses to put in or leave out. When Gulu was a young man, he bought a beautiful yak bull from a distant village. It had taken him 3 years to save the money for the bull, which he planned to use to increase the size of his small herd. It was a long distance to the village where the yak was being sold, Gulu said, shaking his gray beard. The Chinese soldiers were everywhere, and it was dangerous on the road. I traveled at night, and I hid in the hills during the day so they did not rob me or kill me. It took him so long to get to the village that he was afraid the bull would be gone when he got there, either sold to another buyer or killed by the soldiers for food. But the bull was there, he said, and more magnificent than I remembered. His hair was as dark as a moonless night, and his back was as straight as the floor timber and as broad as I am tall, and he laughed. The owner regretted the price he had agreed upon, and he tried to raise it. They argued for 3 days. In the end, Gulu gave the owner all the money he had and a promise to bring him the first 2 calves the bull produced the following year. All of this took too long, Gulu explained. The weather had turned bad. To complicate things, I now had a yak with me that had been pastured for over a year with very little exercise. He was weak in the legs from being pinned. I had to stop often for him to rest and eat. The other difficulty was that I had no money, and I myself had to scavenge for food. He decided the only way he would make it home before he and the yak starved was to take a shortcut through the mountains. He had heard about the shortcut, but he had never traveled it. At first, the route was good. It was far enough from the road so that I could travel during the day without fear of the soldiers. Then the path started to rise. The weather worsened the higher we climbed. The snow was deep. I should have turned back. He grinned and shrugged, but I was young and foolish, and I continued the climb, driving the bull before me. They reached the shortcut summit and started down the other side, Gulu confident now that he and the bull were going to make it home safely. But as he was looking for a place to sleep, an avalanche roared down the mountain and buried him alive. It was so cold, Gulu said with a shudder, more cold than I have ever been in my life, before or since. I remember thinking how unfair it was that the avalanche hadn't killed me when it struck. I waited for death in that cold, dark place, wondering how long it would be. After a while, I felt a tugging on my right arm like a fish nibbling on bait. At first, I didn't know what it was, and then I remembered the bull. When we reached the summit, I had put a rope around his neck to keep him close. It wasn't a long rope, 2 meters, maybe a little shorter. He was close, and he was alive. But was he above me or below me? The snow was so tight around me that I didn't even know if I was face down or face up. I could have been standing on my feet for all I knew, or upside down on my head. We all laughed, but being buried alive, that isn't funny. I am not sure why, Gulu continued, but it seemed important to reach the bull, to touch him one last time, to apologize for taking him from the safety of his pasture. I started to pull myself along the rope. It was slow and painful work. The further I got up the rope, the harder the yak pulled, sometimes smashing my face into the ice before I could clear it away. Perhaps the bull is free, I thought, standing on the surface, tethered by the man beneath. I finally broke through, gasping for breath. The bull was on the surface, but he was not standing. As I examined him, he kicked me several times, but I was so numb that I barely felt it. My beautiful bull had 2 broken legs. I felt shards of bone sticking through his flesh. There was only one thing to do. I unsheathed my knife, and I cut his throat. The bull took a long time to bleed out. Gulu watched with tears freezing to his cheeks. 3 years of hard work and sacrifice lay at his feet, bleeding into the snow. But there was no time for sorrow, he told us. I had to get back to my village. If I didn't, my family would have to pay the debt of the 2 calves. But first, I had to survive the night. He slit the yak open, pulled the guts out onto the snow, then he climbed into the body cavity to warm himself. Early the next morning, my sleep was interrupted by a violent shaking. I thought the yak was slipping down the mountain. I put my head outside the carcass, and I don't know who was more surprised, I or the bear pulling my precious bull down the mountainside. It reared up on its hind feet and let out a heart-stopping bellow that shook every bone in my body. I was certain I would be eaten, but I was saved by the Chinese army. 4 soldiers had been tracking the bear and caught up to it just as it bellowed. They fired and missed, but the bullets were enough to frighten the bear away. It lumbered up the slope and disappeared into the trees. All I had to do now was to contend with the soldiers, Gulu said. But I didn't think this would be a problem. I had no money. If they wanted the yak for food, they were welcome to it. As they reached the carcass, I crawled out from my bloody shelter. When they saw me, the soldiers screamed like frightened children, threw down their rifles, and before I could speak, they ran away. After Gulu returned home, he heard a rumor about 4 soldiers coming across a yeti feeding on a yak. A few weeks later, there was a story about a cow giving birth to a full-grown man. How did you pay for the calves? JR asked. Gulu just smiled. I sold the soldiers' rifles. There was enough money to pay for the calves and to buy a new bull. He was not nearly as magnificent as the one that gave birth to me, but he was a good breeder, and he increased my small herd tenfold. And that's the story of Gulu in chapter 19.